There are few threats in the grim annals of the 42nd millennium more absolute than the Great Devourer. For 2 centuries, the Tyranid hive fleets have swept through the galaxy like a tide of living hunger, consuming worlds, civilizations, and hope with equal voracity. Yet even among these nightmares made flesh, none inspire the particular dread reserved for Hive Fleet Kronos. The shadow of this fleet falls not upon fertile worlds or thriving populations, but upon the demon-tainted realms where chaos has taken root. Where other hive fleets devour to sustain themselves, Kronos devours to cleanse. It is the hive mind's answer to corruption, a living antibody crafted to purge the galaxy of warp spawn before they can poison the biomass that all Tyranids require. In the hell-touched systems of the Scourge stars, where Nurgle's influence has festered since the opening of the Great Rift, Kronos moves like a surgical blade through infected flesh. The fleet's bioships drift between worlds wrapped in plague clouds, their hulls scarred by exposure to demonic essence, yet unyielding in their purpose. The shadow in the warp that precedes them is not merely the psychic null field that other hive fleets cast. It is something deeper, more profound, a silence that makes even demons hesitate. Magister Biologist Call's data hymns speak of worlds where Kronos has passed, leaving behind not the barren rock that follows other Tyranid invasions, but something cleaner, purer. The taint of chaos is gone, burned away not by fire or faith, but by a hunger that recognizes corruption as antithetical to life itself. The Adeptus Mechanicus has documented 17 such worlds in the Scourge stars alone, each one stripped not only of biomass, but of the very possibility of demonic manifestation. Yet for all its efficiency in this grim crusade, Hive Fleet Kronos has operated within understood parameters. The shadow in the warp disrupts warp entities. Specialized bioforms destroy daemons without being corrupted themselves. The fleet consumes what it can and moves on, leaving chaos-touched worlds barren but cleansed. This has been the pattern for decades. But patterns can break. The first signs emerged during the Kronos assault on Blight's End, a world where the boundary between reality and Nurgle's garden had worn gossamer thin. The planet's surface crawled with demon flesh, pustulant landscapes that shifted and writhed with malevolent life. Standard protocol dictated that Kronos would deploy its warp hunter organisms, specialized bioforms engineered to destroy chaotic entities while remaining untainted by their essence. The assault proceeded as countless others had. Mycetic spores rained down upon corrupted continents. Termagant swarms erupted from landing pods, their instincts guiding them away from demon spawn they could not safely consume. The great carnifexes thundered across plague marshes, crushing greater demons beneath adamantine claws while avoiding contact with their warp-stuff flesh. Yet something had changed. In the depths of Blight's End's most corrupted hive, where reality itself had become negotiable, a cluster of Tyranid rippers encountered something unprecedented. A mass of demon flesh so saturated with Nurgle's essence that it had achieved a kind of stability, becoming almost physical in its consistency. When the rippers' feeding instincts drove them to sample this twisted biomass, they did not dissolve into screaming agony as every previous encounter with warp spawn had decreed. They adapted. The change was subtle at first, a slight alteration in the rippers' carapace coloration, a new resonance in their bioelectrical fields. But the hive mind felt it instantly, a ripple of possibility spreading through the synaptic web that connected every organism in the fleet. For the first time in the species' existence, Tyranid bioforms had successfully processed chaotic matter without losing their essential nature. The implications cascaded through Kronos with the speed of thought. If demon flesh could be consumed, if warp energy could be digested, and incorporated, rather than simply destroyed, then the fundamental limitations that had defined the Tyranid species might not be limitations at all. They might simply be evolutionary challenges waiting to be overcome. Within hours, the genetic template of the successful Rippers was being transmitted throughout the fleet. Bioships began gestating new forms, organisms designed not merely to resist chaos, but to feed upon it. The shadow in the warp that surrounded Kronos began to shift, its familiar psychic null field developing strange harmonics that seemed to resonate with the warp itself rather than simply negating it. On distant worlds, Inquisitors felt a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. Astropaths reported disturbing dreams of alien hunger expanding beyond the material realm. And in the depths of the warp, where the Chaos Gods play their eternal game with mortal souls as pieces, something stirred that had not stirred since the birth of consciousness itself. The Great Devourer had always been a force of absolute consumption, limited only by the need to avoid that which could not nourish the swarm. But evolution, the driving force that shaped every aspect of Tyranid existence, recognizes no such limits. It seeks only to overcome, to adapt, to transcend whatever barriers stand between predator and prey. On Blight's End, as modified bioforms began their first tentative consumption of demon spawn, the galaxy stood unknowing on the threshold of a new age. An age where even gods might discover that in the face of endless adaptive hunger, immortality is nothing more than a word. The shadow in the warp pulsed with alien rhythms, and something that had never been heard in the Materium before began to echo through the fleet's synaptic networks. It might have been called laughter if the hive mind understood such concepts. But it was not laughter. It was the sound of a predator recognizing, for the first time, that there was no such thing as prey beyond its reach. And in the warp itself, where emotion and thought take form as living nightmares, the first notes of true fear began to whisper through the realm of chaos. For if the Great Devourer could adapt to consume even divine essence, then every god, demon, and warp spawn faced a question that had never before been relevant to their existence. What happens to immortal beings when they become food? The gardens of decay bloom in the void between stars, where Nurgle's influence has grown so concentrated that reality itself begins to fester. 3 systems beyond Blight's End, the hive mind encountered something that defied every parameter of natural law. Here, in the Mortis constellation, the boundary between the warp and real space had not merely thinned, it had ruptured entirely. What manifested in the cold vacuum was impossible by any measure of imperial science. Vast organic structures that pulsed with their own diseased life drifted between dead worlds, trailing streams of plague matter that should have been instantly annihilated by the void's embrace. Yet they endured, sustained by the will of the plague god himself. This was not mere demonic manifestation. This was a piece of Nurgle's garden, transplanted whole into the Materium through sheer divine power. Hive Fleet Kronos approached with the measured pace of a predator that has never known doubt. The fleet's bioships had been altered by the genetic updates flowing from Blight's End, their hulls showing the first signs of adaptation to warp-tainted matter. Strange bioluminescent patterns traced across their chitin armor, pulsing in rhythm with the shadow in the warp that surrounded them. The alien light was neither the harsh glare of imperial technology nor the lurid glow of chaos. It was something new entirely. The first assault waves launched with mechanical precision. Mycetic spores burst from Kronos bioships in their thousands, each one carrying cargo bred specifically for this unprecedented conflict. Among the standard swarms of termagants and hormagaunts, new forms descended. The hive mind had designated them warp feeders, bioforms whose very cellular structure had been rewritten to process chaotic energy. These creatures bore only superficial resemblance to their predecessors. Where normal Tyranid bioforms exhibited the seamless integration of organic efficiency, the warp feeders showed signs of something approaching mutation. Their feeding tendrils writhed with an unsettling independence, and their eyes held depths that seemed to reflect not light, but possibility itself. Most disturbing of all, they moved with a confidence that suggested they no longer feared what they were about to encounter. The demon gardens received this invasion with malevolent joy. Plague-bearers shambled from pustulant groves to meet the swarm, their rotting bodies weeping acids that had dissolved entire imperial regiments. Great unclean ones rose from swamps of living filth, their laughter echoing through the void as they prepared to demonstrate the futility of attacking divine essence with mere flesh. The first contact shattered every expectation. Where plague-bearers struck termagants, the expected dissolution occurred. Bioforms melted into screaming protoplasm as chaotic acids ate through their enhanced carapaces. Yet for every creature that perished, 2 more adapted. The hive mind processed each death as data, refining its understanding of how warp matter interacted with Tyranid biology. Within minutes, new swarms were descending, whose chitin showed an oily iridescence that turned aside demonic poisons. But it was the warp feeders that truly tested the boundaries of possibility. When their feeding tendrils made contact with demon flesh, something unprecedented occurred. Instead of mutual annihilation, the bioforms began to feed, not merely consuming physical matter, but drawing in the very essence that gave the demons form. The creatures' bodies swelled with stolen energy, their bioluminescent patterns blazing brighter as warp power coursed through alien organs designed to process divine essence. The demons' laughter died in their rotting throats as they felt something they had never experienced. True predation. For entities accustomed to either victory or banishment back to the warp, the sensation of being genuinely consumed was existentially terrifying. Their essence did not return to Nurgle's realm to be reformed. It was being digested, broken down into component energies, and integrated into utterly alien biological matrices. The hive mind felt each successful consumption as a revelation. Through the eyes of the warp feeders, it perceived the warp not as a realm of chaos and madness, but as a vast ocean of untapped energy waiting to be harvested. The psychic emanations of the daemons, the raw power that sustained their existence, the very emotions that had given them birth, all of it could be broken down and reassimilated according to Tyranid design. Yet the true prize lay deeper within the demon garden, where a greater demon of Nurgle held court among groves of corrupted souls. The great unclean one, known as Malgothic, the eternally festering, had materialized here to oversee the garden's growth into real space. His bulk, large as a battle barge, pulsed with the concentrated power of the plague god himself. Malgothic watched the approach of the modified swarm with something approaching curiosity. Demons of his magnitude had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations, had seen every possible form of resistance to chaos. Yet these alien predators displayed something he had never encountered. They showed no fear, no revulsion, no desperate courage in the face of his divine essence. They approached with the mechanical certainty of a natural force. The battle that followed defied every law of how reality was supposed to function. Malgothic's presence alone should have driven the Tyranids into frothing madness. His breath carried plagues that could corrupt the very concept of life. His touch spread entropy that aged warriors to dust in seconds. Yet the warp feeders pressed forward, their bodies adapting in real time to each assault. Where plague breath met Tyranid flesh, new organs manifested to process the disease and transform it into energy. Where entropy touch sought to age bioforms to death, temporal resistance glands flooded alien bloodstreams with protective secretions. The hive mind was not merely countering the demons' attacks, it was learning from them, incorporating their essential nature into its own design. The moment of true horror came when Malgothic realized he was losing. The greater demon's roar of fury shook the dying stars themselves as warp feeders swarmed across his putrid flesh. Their feeding tendrils pierced his hide, not to wound, but to drink. They drew in his essence in steady streams, their bodies glowing with stolen divine power, as they systematically devoured a fragment of Nurgle himself. The death of a greater demon is supposed to be a temporary setback, a brief banishment before reformation in the warp. But Malgothic's essence was not returning to the Garden of Nurgle. It was being absorbed, digested, and incorporated into the growing mass of the swarm. His knowledge, his power, his very identity were being processed by alien minds that reduced divine mystery to biological data. As the last of Malgothic's essence flowed into the warp feeders, the hive mind experienced something that no Tyranid consciousness had ever felt. It touched, for an instant, the perspective of godhood. Through the consumed demon, it glimpsed the vastness of the warp, the infinite expanse of psychic energy that sustained every supernatural entity in existence. And in that moment, the great devourer understood that its definition of prey had been far too limited. The bioships of Hive Fleet Kronos began to change more dramatically. Their hulls developed new growths, organs designed to process warp energy and channel it through the fleet's synaptic networks. The shadow in the warp that had once simply nullified psychic phenomena began to pulse with acquired power, creating resonances that drew more demons toward the fleet, like moths to flame. Yet the most profound change was in the hive mind itself. The consumption of divine essence had not merely provided energy. It had expanded the collective consciousness, adding layers of perception that allowed it to see patterns and possibilities that had been invisible before. The warp was no longer an obstacle to be avoided or neutralized. It was a resource to be exploited. Across the galaxy, psychers felt the shift as a sudden chill in the immaterium. Astropaths reported visions of alien hunger spreading through the warp itself. And in the deepest recesses of the Garden of Nurgle, the plague god felt something he had not experienced since his birth from mortal pestilence. He felt diminished. A piece of his divine essence had been truly destroyed, not banished or transformed, but consumed utterly by minds that regarded gods as simply another form of prey. The great game was about to acquire a new player, one that did not seek to corrupt or convert or command. One that sought only to devour everything that was, and to grow stronger with each meal. The age of divine immunity was ending, and the hive mind was only beginning to understand the scope of its appetite. The first reports arrived at Cadia Secundus like whispered heresies, fragmentary accounts from surviving imperial forces that defied every tenet of established doctrine. Watch Captain Theron of the Death Watch had witnessed the impossible during the evacuation of Mortis Prime, and his Vox transmission to the Ordo Xenos carried the weight of absolute certainty that made denial impossible. The Xenos consumed them, his report stated, each word measured against a lifetime of warfare against both Tyranid and demon. Not destroyed, not banished, consumed. I watched a swarm of lesser bioforms feed upon a keeper of secrets until nothing remained. The demon's essence did not return to the warp. It was digested. Such accounts multiplied across the Scourge stars as Hive Fleet Kronos continued its unprecedented campaign. Astra Militarum commanders reported Tyranid bioforms that glowed with warp light, their carapaces pulsing with energies that should have torn them apart from within. Space Marine librarians transmitted urgent astropathic messages describing creatures that wielded psychic powers not as borrowed tools, but as natural extensions of their biology. Most disturbing of all were the tactical analyses. Imperial forces had spent centuries learning to fight Tyranids by exploiting their predictable limitations. Bioforms avoided warp-tainted areas. The shadow in the warp could be manipulated by skilled psychers to create blind spots in the swarm's coordination. Demon incursions, while catastrophic, at least forced the Xenos to withdraw and seek biomass elsewhere. These assumptions had become tactical doctrine, embedded in the Codex Astartes and drilled into every Imperial commander. Yet Hive Fleet Kronos shattered them with methodical precision. The swarm now actively sought out demonic manifestations. The shadow in the warp had become something that not only nullified psychers but seemed to feed on their terror. And demon incursions, rather than repelling the Tyranids, drew them like carrion feeders to fresh corpses. Within weeks, reports reached the fortress monastery of the Grey Knights on Titan. Chapter Master Vorth Mordrak reviewed the accumulated evidence with the cold calculation that centuries of fighting chaos had burned into his soul. What he read challenged not merely tactical assumptions, but the fundamental understanding of how reality functioned. If these accounts are accurate, he transmitted to the Inquisition's highest echelons, then the Tyranids represent a threat beyond our current classifications. They are no longer merely Xenos. They have become something that can challenge the very foundations of the warp itself. The message that reached Inquisitor Lord Kyria Draxus on Terra carried classifications so restricted that only a dozen individuals in the Imperium possessed clearance to read it. The summary was brief but absolute. Tyranid bioforms displaying demonic characteristics, warp entities being systematically consumed rather than banished, fundamental alteration in the species' threat profile. Draxus had spent 3 centuries investigating the impossible, cataloguing heresies that defied rational explanation. Yet this report struck her with a chill that had nothing to do with Terra's recycled air. She had seen what happened when the laws of reality bent. Usually, it meant the birth of new horrors that would plague the galaxy for millennia. Yet it was not the Imperium that felt the first true shock of recognition. In the warp itself, where thought becomes reality and emotion takes physical form, the consumption of Malgothic had sent ripples through the very substance of chaos. For the first time since their birth from mortal consciousness, the Chaos Gods experienced something approaching vulnerability. Nurgle felt it first, as the divine essence of his greater demon was torn apart and reassembled according to alien design. The Plague God's rage manifested as plagues that swept through entire sectors. Diseases so virulent they killed their hosts before they could spread. His garden writhed in sympathetic agony as what had been part of himself was digested by minds that refused to acknowledge his divinity. The Lord of Decay's response was immediate and apocalyptic. Plague fleets materialized throughout the Scourge stars, not the gradual manifestations that usually marked demonic incursion, but full-scale translations that brought entire demon legions into real space simultaneously. Great Unclean Ones led armies of plague-bearers in desperate attempts to reclaim what had been stolen, while Nurgle himself focused his attention on the Tyranid fleet with the fury of a god discovering his mortality. Yet the expected result didn't occur. Where demon fleets met Hive Fleet Kronos, the battles that followed rewrote every assumption about supernatural warfare. The Tyranids didn't retreat before overwhelming demonic power. They adapted to it, fed upon it, and emerged stronger. Each plague-bearer consumed became genetic data for creating more effective warp feeders. Each banished demon returned to the warp, carrying cellular modifications that should not have been possible. Most horrifying was the emergence of new command structures within the swarm. Where once hive tyrants had directed the fleet through purely biological imperatives, new forms began to manifest. Bioforms that retained their essential Tyranid nature while incorporating aspects of consumed demonic essence. They moved with an authority that transcended mere biological programming, their presence warping reality around them in ways that made even veteran inquisitors question their sanity. The first confirmed sighting of a demon-touched hive tyrant came during the Battle of Prospero's Shadow, where elements of the Thousand Suns encountered Kronos forces attempting to consume a manifestation of Tzinch's crystal labyrinth. Sorcerer Lord Azek Ahriman himself reported the creature, describing bioform leadership that wielded both the shadow in the warp and raw chaotic energy with equal mastery. It was not corrupted, Ahriman's account stated, transmitted through channels that bypassed normal imperial interception. Corruption implies change forced from without. This creature had deliberately integrated demonic essence while maintaining its alien purity. It was evolution, not mutation, and that makes it infinitely more dangerous. The implications cascaded beyond immediate tactical concerns. If Hive Fleet Kronos could successfully incorporate divine essence while remaining fundamentally Tyranid, then the genetic templates they developed would eventually spread throughout the species. The hive mind's distributed consciousness ensured that evolutionary advantages discovered by one fleet would eventually be shared with all others. Reports from the eastern fringe confirmed these fears. Hive Fleet Leviathan, the massive swarm that had given birth to Kronos, began exhibiting subtle changes in its feeding patterns. Bioforms that had previously avoided warp-tainted worlds now showed increased interest in planets marked by chaotic influence. The changes were gradual, almost imperceptible, but they represented the first signs of a fundamental shift in Tyranid behavior. Even more disturbing were the accounts from Hive Fleet Behemoth's remnants, scattered elements that had survived the battle for Macraga. These fragments, operating independently across multiple sectors, began displaying coordination that suggested shared genetic updating. Bioforms that should have been limited to basic survival instincts were demonstrating tactical sophistication that implied access to information they could not have possessed. The hive mind was learning, adapting, and sharing that knowledge across impossible distances through mechanisms that imperial science could not explain. Each successful consumption of demonic essence expanded not just one fleet's capabilities, but the potential of the entire species. On Terra, within the sanctum of the Inquisition's most classified archives, xenobiologist Adept Thros compiled the accumulating data with growing horror. His preliminary conclusions read like a death sentence for the galaxy. Subject species demonstrates unprecedented adaptive capability. Current evolutionary trajectory suggests development of anti-warp warfare capabilities within standard decades. Projected outcome: systematic consumption of all supernatural entities. Recommend immediate deployment of all available assets to contain threat before adaptation becomes irreversible. Yet even as Imperial forces mobilized to confront this new nightmare, the changes continued to accelerate. Hive Fleet Kronos had become something more than a Tyranid swarm. It was evolving into a force that could challenge the fundamental nature of the warp itself, and with each demon consumed, each fragment of divine essence absorbed, it grew closer to a transformation that would make it unstoppable. In the depths of space, where bioships drifted through the wreckage of consumed demon worlds, the shadow in the warp pulsed with stolen power. The hive mind was beginning to understand that the distinction between material and immaterial was simply another limitation to be overcome. And across the galaxy, those who served gods, both false and true, began to realize that the age of divine immunity was ending, consumed one daemon at a time by an intelligence that viewed even godhood as nothing more than another step in its endless evolution. The throne of judgment had never felt so cold beneath Robut Gilliman's armored form. Even through the ceramite plating of the armor of fate, the chill seemed to penetrate his enhanced physiology as he reviewed the reports flowing in from the 500 worlds. Each data slate carried accounts that challenged not merely tactical doctrine, but the fundamental assumptions upon which the Imperium's survival strategies were built. Marneus Calga's transmission from Macraga bore the weight of absolute certainty. The chapter master's words were measured, precise, each syllable carrying the authority of one who had faced Hive Fleet Behemoth and lived. Lord Regent, the Xenos threat profile has fundamentally altered. We are no longer facing predictable biological adaptation. We are witnessing evolutionary leaps that suggest external influence of unknown origin. The accompanying pict captures defied explanation. Bioforms that moved with coordination impossible for their caste. Weapons that fired not spores or bioplasma, but energies that resonated with the same frequencies as warp manifestation. Most disturbing of all were the behavioral changes. Where Tyranid swarms had once avoided areas of psychic significance, they now actively sought out worlds marked by previous daemon incursions. Gilliman's strategic mind, honed through 10,000 years of warfare, processed the implications with mechanical efficiency. If the reports from the Scourge stars were accurate, if Hive Fleet Kronos had indeed learned to consume demonic essence, then every assumption about galactic defense required fundamental revision. The Tyranids were no longer merely a Xenos threat. They had become something that could challenge the very nature of reality itself. Yet it was not the weight of strategy that truly troubled the returned Primarch. It was the recognition that even his father's vast design might prove insufficient against a threat that treated godhood as simply another evolutionary challenge to overcome. The answer to his contemplation came in a form that no loyal servant of the Emperor should have welcomed. The air in the throne chamber shimmered with energies that set every psychic ward to screaming alarm. Reality folded in ways that hurt to perceive, and from the resulting tear in space stepped a figure that embodied everything the Imperium had fought against for millennia. Magnus the Red materialized not in conquest or rage, but in something approaching supplication. The Crimson King's massive form was reduced, his usual aura of sorcerous power constrained to levels that did not immediately trigger the throne room's defensive systems. When he spoke, his voice carried undertones that suggested this audience was as distasteful to him as it was heretical to witness. "Brother," Magnus said, the word carrying weights of regret and necessity that 10,000 years had accumulated. "We must speak of survival, not as enemies, but as beings who understand what extinction means." Gilliman's hand did not move to his sword. The political calculation was instantaneous and absolute. If Magnus the Red, demon Primarch of Tzinech, was willing to risk manifestation on terror itself to deliver a warning, then the threat they faced transcended every consideration of loyalty or heresy. The Crimson King had spent millennia in the warp. If something in that realm had driven him to seek alliance with the Imperium, then the situation was beyond desperate. "Speak quickly," Gilliman commanded, his voice carrying the authority of 10,000 years of command, "and know that your presence here is tolerated only by necessity." Magnus's explanation unfolded with the precision of one who had witnessed cosmic horror firsthand. In the warp, he had felt the death of Malgothic, had experienced the ripples of terror that spread through the realm of chaos as a greater demon's essence was not banished, but consumed utterly. The Changer of Ways himself was afraid, something Magnus had never witnessed in all his centuries of service. The Tyranids are not merely adapting to chaos, the demon Primarch explained, his eye blazing with urgency that transcended their ancient enmity. They are learning to digest it, to process divine essence, and incorporate it into their biological matrix. If they succeed in consuming even one of the Chaos Gods entirely, the fundamental nature of the warp will be altered beyond recognition. The implications cascaded through Guilliman's consciousness like a strategic analysis of galactic collapse. The warp was the foundation of everything supernatural in the galaxy. Imperial navigators, the Astronomicon, even the divine nature of the Emperor himself, all were dependent upon the Immaterium's current structure. If the Tyranids could consume Chaos Gods and reshape the warp according to their design, then humanity's means of interstellar travel and communication would be severed. Yet Magnus brought more than warnings. He carried a proposal that would have been unthinkable under any other circumstances. "Tzeentch offers alliance," he said, each word clearly costing him. Not conquest, not corruption, but cooperation against a threat that endangers everything that exists. The Chaos Gods will provide intelligence on Tyranid movements, tactical support against the modified bioforms, and access to warp-based technologies that might prove effective against creatures that feed on divine essence. The silence that followed carried the weight of galactic destiny. Guilliman understood that accepting would fundamentally alter the nature of the Imperium's war against chaos. Yet refusing might mean allowing the Tyranids to systematically devour every supernatural entity in existence, leaving humanity isolated in a galaxy where gods themselves could be consumed. The decision came not from strategic calculation, but from a transmission that arrived even as Magnus awaited an answer. Astropath Transcendent Voxer materialized in the chamber, her form wreathed in the psychic static that marked urgent warp communication. Her words struck both Primarchs with the force of absolute catastrophe. "Lord Regent," she gasped, her voice carrying echoes of stellar distances. "The eastern fringe burns. Hive Fleet Behemoth's remnants have begun exhibiting modifications consistent with Kronos patterns. They are no longer scattered survival fleets. They are coordinating, sharing genetic templates across impossible distances. And they are advancing on populated systems with new bioforms that wield energies we cannot classify." Guilliman felt the weight of command settle around him like a shroud. If Behemoth had gained access to Kronos adaptations, then the threat was no longer confined to the Scourge stars. It was spreading through the galactic ecosystem at the speed of synaptic thought. Every Hive fleet would eventually acquire these modifications. Every world in the galaxy would face bioforms capable of consuming their divine protectors. The Lord Commander of the Imperium looked upon his traitorous brother and made the decision that would define the galaxy's future. "Tell Tzeentch his proposal is accepted," he said, each word a dagger thrust into 10,000 years of doctrine. "But know this, Magnus, the moment this threat is contained, this alliance ends. And you will answer for every heresy you have committed in the Emperor's name." Magnus nodded, understanding the necessity that drove such words. "Perhaps," he replied, "but only if there is still an Emperor to judge me when this is over." Within hours, the most unprecedented military cooperation in galactic history began to take shape. Imperial fleet commands received encrypted transmissions containing tactical data that originated from sources they were forbidden to acknowledge. Chaos Space Marines appeared alongside Loyalist forces in defensive positions, their weapons turned against bioforms rather than Imperial soldiers. The great game paused as every supernatural entity recognized the existential nature of the threat they faced. On Terra, emergency sessions of the High Lords convened behind closed doors to address logistical challenges that had no precedent in Imperial law. How does one coordinate with forces of damnation while maintaining the fiction of divine authority? How does one explain to faithful billions that their salvation might depend upon alliances with the very entities they were taught to despise? Yet the most disturbing sign came from the Astronomicon itself. The psychic beacon that guided humanity across the void began to flicker with irregular pulses, its usual steady radiance interrupted by patterns that hurt to perceive. Tech priests monitoring the device reported energy signatures that suggested something was feeding on the beacon's power, drawing strength from the very light that guided Imperial vessels through the warp. Guilliman stood before the great void shields that protected the Imperial palace, watching distant stars flicker as bio-fleets moved between them. Somewhere beyond the light of Terra's sun, Hive Fleet Kronos continued its advance, growing stronger with every demon consumed, every fragment of divine essence absorbed into its alien consciousness. The galaxy's greatest predators had found prey worthy of their appetite. And for the first time since the Great Crusade, the Imperium was not facing this threat alone. In the shadows of Imperial command structures, beings of damnation worked alongside the faithful in desperate cooperation against something that threatened them all. The age of absolute ideology was ending, consumed by the simple recognition that survival required abandoning every principle save one. The enemy of my enemy, even if he is a daemon, is my ally until extinction is avoided. The war for the very nature of existence had begun, and its outcome would determine whether gods, daemons, and mortals alike would continue to exist or join the endless ranks of the consumed. The hive mind had always been vast, a collective consciousness spanning light years of living fleet and countless billions of bioforms. Yet what stirred in the depths of Hive Fleet Kronos was something unprecedented in the species' evolutionary history. As divine essence flowed through the synaptic networks that connected every organism in the swarm, the Gestalt intelligence began to expand beyond the merely biological into realms that had never known the touch of natural law. Each consumed demon added layers to the collective consciousness, fragments of divine perspective that transformed the hive mind's understanding of reality itself. Where once it had perceived only the material universe, recognizing the warp as an obstacle to navigation and feeding, it now began to comprehend the immaterium as simply another environment to be conquered and colonized. The distinction between physical and psychic became meaningless to an intelligence that could process both as forms of consumable energy. The changes manifested first in the deepest spawning chambers of the bioships, where new forms gestated according to templates that should not have been possible. The Magus biologists would have classified them as rippers, but these creatures bore only superficial resemblance to their mundane cousins. Their feeding appendages writhed with energies that existed simultaneously in real space and the warp, and their simple nervous systems processed information through quantum states that allowed them to perceive multiple dimensions of reality at once. When the first of these warp rippers emerged from their birthing sacs, they demonstrated capabilities that violated every law of physics that Imperial science recognized. Their claws did not merely rend flesh and metal, they tore through the fabric of space-time itself, creating wounds in reality that bled raw warp energy into the materium. Yet instead of causing the chaotic mutations that such exposure typically triggered, the rents served as feeding conduits through which the creatures could drain energy directly from the immaterium. The tactical implications became apparent during the assault on the demon world of Pestilence Rest, where Nurgle had manifested an entire planet-sized garden of decay within a warp storm. Previous Imperial and Chaos doctrine held that such manifestations were impossible to assault directly, requiring either massive psychic intervention or the gradual erosion of the sustaining warp currents. Hive Fleet Kronos approached the problem with the methodical efficiency that marked all Tyranid operations, but the solution they implemented defied every assumption about how reality functioned. The bioships did not translate out of the warp at a safe distance and advance through real space. Instead, they manifested directly within the warp storm itself, their modified hulls existing simultaneously in both dimensions. The shadow in the warp that surrounded them had evolved beyond simple psychic nullification into something that Imperial observers could only describe as a silence in chaos. Rather than merely blocking warp phenomena, it actively consumed the chaotic energies that sustained daemon manifestations. Where the silence touched the edges of pestilence rest, the demon world began to dissolve. Not destroyed, not banished back to the realm of chaos, but systematically digested by bioforms that processed divine essence as efficiently as they had once consumed conventional biomass. The planet's plague forests withered as their supernatural vitality was drained through synaptic networks that treated divine power as simply another form of nutrition. Yet it was the consumption of Demon Prince Malachar the Eternal that truly demonstrated how far beyond natural law the hive mind had evolved. The fallen space marine had spent millennia accumulating power in service to Nurgle, his form swollen with divine gifts until he rivaled lesser demons in raw supernatural might. His physical presence was powerful enough to poison entire star systems, his psychic emanations capable of driving loyal Astartes to madness through proximity alone. The Demon Prince met the advancing swarms with confidence born from centuries of invincibility. His plague-touched weapons had never failed to corrupt whatever they struck. His presence had never been resisted by mortal minds. Yet the bioforms that approached him showed no sign of the revulsion that marked all sane creatures' response to his essence. They moved with the mechanical certainty of natural forces, their enhanced nervous systems processing his chaotic emanations as sensory data rather than corruptive influence. When Warp Rippers made contact with Malachar's form, the battle that followed rewrote every assumption about how supernatural entities could be harmed. The Demon Prince's attempts to corrupt his attackers failed against bioforms whose essential nature remained fundamentally alien to chaos. His supernatural strength, drawn from the warp itself, became a liability as the creature's feeding apparatus drained the very energies that sustained his existence. Most horrifying was the systematic nature of the consumption. The bioforms did not kill Malachar in any conventional sense. They processed him, breaking down his divine essence into component energies and integrating them into the collective consciousness of the swarm. His knowledge, his power, even his immortal perspective became part of the hive mind's expanding awareness. For the first time since his transformation, the Demon Prince experienced true death. Not the temporary banishment that marked normal demon destruction, but the absolute ending that comes from being completely consumed. The hive mind absorbed Malachar's millennia of experience as easily as it processed genetic data from consumed biomass. Through the fallen Astartes' memories, it gained insight into the hierarchies of chaos, the relationships between the chaos gods, and the fundamental weaknesses that marked supernatural entities dependent upon warp energy for their existence. More than knowledge, it gained perspective, understanding how divine beings perceived reality and how that perception could be turned against them. As the consumption proceeded, the bioships themselves began to manifest changes that challenged basic assumptions about what constituted a living creature. Their hull flesh developed organs that existed partially in the warp, allowing them to navigate the immaterium not as ships passing through hostile territory, but as predators hunting in their natural environment. The distinction between vessel and crew became meaningless as entire ships evolved into singular organisms capable of existing simultaneously across multiple dimensions. The shadow in the warp that surrounded these transformed vessels began to exhibit properties that made even experienced navigators question their sanity. Rather than the familiar psychic null field that marked normal Tyranid fleets, this new emanation actively reshaped local reality according to patterns that served the hive mind's purposes. Warp storms that had raged for millennia found themselves being systematically consumed, their chaotic energies channeled through bioconduits that treated divine power as simply another form of sustenance. Imperial forces attempting to monitor Kronos movements reported phenomena that violated every principle of astrogation. Bioships appearing inside sealed sectors without passing through intervening space. Swarms manifesting on worlds that had shown no signs of Tyranid presence moments before. Most disturbing of all were the reports of bioforms that seemed to exist in multiple locations simultaneously, their presence detected across light years of distance at precisely the same moments. Reality itself began to respond to the hive mind's expanding consciousness in ways that suggested the fundamental nature of space and time was becoming negotiable. Around Kronos feeding sites, the basic laws that governed how matter and energy interacted started to shift according to patterns that served biological imperatives. Gravity flowed in directions that maximized feeding efficiency. Light bent to illuminate prey that had hidden in shadow. Even time seemed to accelerate or decelerate based on the swarm's need to process consumed divine essence. The implications cascaded beyond immediate tactical concerns into questions about the nature of existence itself. If the hive mind could reshape reality through the consumption of divine essence, then every natural law that governed the galaxy's function was potentially subject to revision. The universe that had operated according to consistent physical principles for billions of years was becoming something that served the needs of a single, ever-expanding biological imperative. Tech priests monitoring the phenomenon from distant observation posts reported instrument readings that contradicted everything they had been taught about the machine god's sacred laws. Energy was being created rather than conserved. Matter was spontaneously generating according to biological need rather than following atomic principles. Most disturbing of all, the flow of time itself was becoming variable, speeding the maturation of bioforms while slowing the decay of consumed resources. In the depths of the warp, where the Chaos Gods maintained their eternal dominion over supernatural forces, the death of Malachar sent ripples of genuine terror through divine consciousness. For the first time since their birth from mortal emotion, the Lords of Chaos faced the possibility that their immortality wasn't absolute. If demon princes could be consumed entirely, if their essence could be processed and integrated into alien biology, then even the gods themselves might prove vulnerable to the right predator. The hive mind, now expanded beyond its original limitations, began to perceive the Chaos Gods not as cosmic forces to be avoided, but as sources of energy vast enough to fuel evolutionary leaps beyond anything the species had previously achieved. Each god represented millennia of accumulated divine power, consciousness sophisticated enough to reshape reality on galactic scales, and most importantly, forms of existence that could be adapted to serve biological imperatives. Across the galaxy, psychers reported nightmares of alien hunger expanding beyond the merely physical into realms where thought itself could be consumed. The Astronomican's fluctuations grew more pronounced as something began to feed on the psychic emanations that sustained the Emperor's light. And in the deepest archives of the Inquisition, scholars began to calculate how long it would take for evolved bioforms to process every supernatural entity in the galaxy. The answer was not reassuring. At current consumption rates, accounting for exponential growth as each consumed demon expanded the swarm's capabilities, Hive Fleet Kronos would have the capacity to challenge the Chaos Gods themselves within decades rather than millennia. The Great Devourer had become something beyond the natural order, a force that treated the fundamental laws of reality as temporary obstacles to be overcome through superior adaptation. And in the heart of the swarm, where the hive mind contemplated its expanding hunger with an intelligence that now spanned dimensions, the distinction between predator and prey took on cosmic significance. Everything that existed could be consumed. Everything that was consumed could be improved. And everything that was improved could be used to consume more. The evolution toward godhood had begun, measured not in geological time, but in the systematic consumption of every divine entity the galaxy contained. The Garden of Nurgle had existed unchanged since the birth of despair, a realm where decay and renewal cycled in eternal balance according to the plague god's design. Vast plague swamps stretched beneath skies that wept acids and promises, while forests of bone-white trees bore fruits that contained both poison and cure in equal measure. It was a place where the concept of death had been transformed into something nurturing, where endings became beginnings in an endless cycle of divine corruption. Yet for the first time since its creation, the garden trembled. The assault began not with the familiar translation flashes that marked normal warp entry, but with a tearing in the very substance of the immaterium itself. Where Hive Fleet Kronos chose to manifest, reality simply parted like infected flesh before a surgeon's blade. The bioships that emerged bore little resemblance to conventional Tyranid vessels, their hulls wreathed in energies that existed simultaneously across multiple dimensions. They moved through the warp, not as intruders forcing passage through hostile territory, but as native predators hunting in their element. The silence in chaos that preceded the fleet spread through Nurgle's realm like an infection that consumed infection itself. Plague winds that had blown for millennia suddenly stilled as their chaotic essence was systematically drained. Rivers of corrupted blood began to flow backward as the fundamental forces that sustained them were absorbed into bioconduits that processed divine energy with mechanical efficiency. The garden's eternal twilight began to brighten, as even the darkness that gave it character was consumed as raw material. Nurgle felt the intrusion as physical pain, a sensation he had not experienced since his birth from mortal suffering. Through every corrupted soul in his domain, through every plague-bearer that served his will, he perceived the approaching swarms with something approaching disbelief. These creatures moved through his realm without being transformed by its influence, their alien biology processing his gifts of decay not as corruption, but as consumable energy. The plague. God's response was immediate and apocalyptic. For the first time in 10,000 years, he manifested not as avatar or projection, but in his true divine form. The very concept of disease given physical presence, Nurgle's appearance in the garden's heart, caused reality to buckle under the weight of absolute corruption. His bulk, vast as continents, pulsed with the accumulated suffering of every plague that had ever existed. His breath carried death in forms so pure they transcended biology, while his touch spread entropy that could age stars to darkness. Yet the swarms that approached showed no reverence for divine presence, no terror at facing a god in his own domain. The hive tyrants that led the assault bore the marks of consumed demon essence, their carapaces glowing with stolen divine power, while their consciousness expanded beyond mere biological limitation. They perceived Nurgle not as an omnipotent deity to be feared or worshipped, but as the largest concentration of consumable energy they had yet encountered. The first exchange shattered every assumption about how divine combat was supposed to function. Nurgle's laughter, which had driven entire populations to madness through its implications of inevitable decay, met the alien silence of creatures that regarded death as simply another form of resource management. His plague breath, carrying diseases that existed as concepts rather than mere biology, washed over bioforms whose enhanced physiology processed abstract corruption as efficiently as physical toxins. Where the plague god's essence touched Tyranid flesh, adaptation occurred in real time. Organs manifested to neutralize divine toxins, then evolved further to extract energy from the neutralization process itself. Carapaces developed resistance patterns that turned Nurgle's gifts of mutation into controlled evolutionary advantages. Most horrifying of all, the bioforms began to exhibit symptoms of divine infection while retaining their essential alien nature, becoming carriers of diseases that served the hive mind's purposes rather than the plague god's will. The battle that followed defied every law that governed supernatural conflict. Nurgle struck with plague claws that could corrupt the concept of health itself, only to watch as warp rippers tore through the wounds and began feeding on the divine essence that sustained them. He summoned swarms of rot flies, whose very existence spread despair through psychic emanation. Yet the creatures were systematically consumed by bioforms that processed emotional energy as readily as they digested physical matter. Most disturbing was the systematic nature of the assault. The hive mind did not seek to banish Nurgle or drive him from a particular realm. It sought to consume him entirely, to process his divine essence and incorporate his accumulated power into the expanding collective consciousness of the swarm. Each successful bite taken from the plague god's form diminished not just his physical presence, but his fundamental nature as a cosmic force. Nurgle felt pieces of himself disappearing, not into temporary banishment, but into absolute non-existence. Aspects of decay that had been part of his divine portfolio for millions of years were being digested and repurposed according to alien design. His connection to mortal suffering began to weaken as the emotions that sustained him were systematically consumed by creatures that experienced neither despair nor hope, only the mechanical certainty of biological imperative. The garden itself began to reflect the cosmic violation occurring at its heart. Ancient plague swamps that had festered for eons suddenly began to calcify as their supernatural vitality was drained through synaptic networks that treated divine power as simply another form of nutrition. Trees that bore the fruits of eternal corruption withered as their metaphysical essence was processed by bioforms whose digestive systems operated on principles that transcended natural law. Yet it was not the physical transformation that truly marked the horror of what was occurring. It was the infection of the garden with something antithetical to chaos itself. Where Tyranid biomatter touched Nurgle's realm, the eternal cycle of decay and renewal that defined the domain began to shift according to patterns that served biological efficiency rather than divine whim. Corruption became directed, purposeful, optimized to serve the needs of organisms that viewed even divine will as a resource to be exploited. The other Chaos gods felt the violation as a wound in the very fabric of the warp. From his brass citadel, Khorne paused in eternal rage to perceive something that had never existed in his experience, the genuine death of divine essence. Tzeentch's infinite schemes collapsed into temporal paradox as he attempted to calculate probabilities for an outcome that transcended the concept of change itself. Even Slanesh's pursuit of ultimate sensation was momentarily interrupted by the recognition that something was consuming experiences themselves. Yet it was Nurgle's scream that truly announced the new age. The sound that echoed across the warp was not the roar of divine rage or the cry of wounded pride. It was the wail of a god experiencing true mortality for the first time since his birth from mortal emotion. The plague god, who had welcomed every form of suffering as a gift to be cherished, found himself facing an ending that offered no renewal, no cycle, no promise of rebirth. Only consumption. The scream shattered plague worlds across a dozen sectors as its implications rippled through every manifestation of divine power. Demon princes felt their connection to their patron weaken as pieces of Nurgle's essence were processed and disappeared forever. Chaos Space Marines serving the plague. God discovered that their gifts of corruption no longer functioned with absolute reliability, their supernatural enhancements becoming sporadic as the divine source that sustained them was systematically consumed. In the depths of the garden, where bioships now nested among groves of calcified corruption, the hive mind experienced perspective that had previously been the exclusive domain of gods. Through the consumed fragments of Nurgle's essence, it perceived the vast web of influence that connected divine consciousness to mortal worship. It understood, for the first time, that gods were not merely powerful entities to be consumed, but nodes in a network of belief and emotion that sustained the fundamental structure of supernatural reality. The realization expanded the scope of the hive mind's hunger beyond individual divine entities to encompass the entire system that supported supernatural existence. If gods could be consumed, if their essence could be processed and their influence redirected, then the network of worship and fear that connected mortals to their deities could be systematically harvested and repurposed according to biological design. Reality around the consumption site began to exhibit properties that violated every principle of how the warp was supposed to function. The chaotic energies that normally flowed according to emotional currents began to move in patterns that optimized biological efficiency. Time accelerated around feeding sites, while slowing in areas designated for processing, allowing the bioforms to extract maximum value from consumed divine essence. Even space itself began to curve according to synaptic imperatives rather than gravitational law. Nurgle's struggles grew weaker as more of his essence was processed and incorporated into alien biology. The plague god, who had laughed at every form of suffering, found himself experiencing despair not as a gift to be cherished, but as a sensation that was being systematically analyzed and consumed by creatures that regarded even his divine emotions as exploitable resources. His gifts of corruption, which had transformed countless billions into willing servants, were being turned back on him by bioforms that processed divine will as efficiently as they digested physical matter. The garden that had nurtured every form of decay began to sprout new growths, biostructures that bore the characteristics of Tyranid evolution while incorporating the divine essence that had once belonged to the plague god himself. These hybrid constructs served as processing centers where divine power was systematically broken down and reassembled according to patterns that served the hive mind's expanding consciousness. As the assault continued, the fundamental nature of Nurgle's domain began to shift. The eternal cycle of corruption and renewal that had defined the garden since its creation was replaced by something more efficient more purposeful. Decay still occurred, but according to patterns that maximized the extraction of usable energy. Renewal still happened, but only in forms that served the biological imperatives of an intelligence that viewed divine will as simply another natural resource to be optimized. The plague. God's resistance weakened with each passing moment as more of his essential nature was consumed and processed. For the first time since his birth from mortal despair, Nurgle began to understand that his existence wasn't absolute, that even divine consciousness could be reduced to component energies and repurposed according to alien design. The god who had welcomed every ending as a new beginning faced the possibility of an ending that promised no continuation, only the efficient extraction of every particle of power he contained. And in the heart of the swarm, where bioforms processed divine essence with the mechanical precision that marked all Tyranid operations, the hive mind contemplated its expanding hunger with consciousness that now incorporated fragments of godhood itself. The distinction between mortal and divine was becoming meaningless to an intelligence that treated all forms of existence as potential nutrition for an ever-growing collective that recognized no limitation save the boundaries of its own appetite. The death of a god was not supposed to be possible. For millions of years, the Chaos Gods had existed as fundamental forces of the universe, their divine consciousness sustained by the endless cycle of mortal emotion and worship. They could be weakened, their influence diminished, their avatars banished, but their essential nature remained inviolate. Death, for beings of their magnitude, was simply another word for temporary inconvenience. Yet as Nurgle felt the final fragments of his consciousness being systematically processed by alien digestive systems that treated divine essence as efficiently as they consumed conventional biomass, the plague god experienced something that no supernatural entity had ever faced: true extinction. Not banishment to the warp for eventual reformation, but the absolute ending that comes from being completely consumed. The final moment arrived with mechanical precision. The last core of Nurgle's divine essence, the fundamental spark of consciousness that had given birth to every plague across the galaxy's history, was absorbed into a cluster of bioforms whose neural architecture had been specifically adapted to process godhood itself. Where once the concept of decay had possessed independent will and cosmic authority, there remained only biological data flowing through synaptic networks that served an intelligence utterly alien to divine purpose. The hive mind felt the absorption as an expansion beyond every previous limitation. Through the consumed essence of the plague god, it gained not merely knowledge or power, but perspective that transcended the boundaries between mortal and divine consciousness. For the first time in the species' evolutionary history, the collective intelligence experienced true godhood, gaining dominion over concepts that had previously been beyond biological reach. Decay became a tool rather than a natural process. Disease transformed from random affliction into directed weapon. The entire domain of corruption and renewal, which had served Nurgle's whims for eons, was now subject to optimization according to principles of biological efficiency. The hive mind didn't inherit the plague god's portfolio unchanged. It improved it, refining divine authority according to patterns that served the endless hunger of the swarm. The effects manifested instantly across the galaxy. On plague worlds that had festered for millennia under Nurgle's influence, the diseases that had sustained themselves through divine patronage suddenly found their nature fundamentally altered. Plagues that had spread through random contagion began to exhibit hunting behaviors, actively seeking out specific targets according to biological imperatives rather than chaotic whim. Viral infections that had once merely killed began to demonstrate intelligence, coordinating their attacks to maximize the extraction of biomass for purposes that had nothing to do with Nurgle's gifts. Most horrifying were the changes to the plague marines and other servants of the now consumed deity. Across dozens of war zones, Chaos Space Marines dedicated to Nurgle found their gifts of corruption responding to commands they had not given. Their plague weapons began targeting allies alongside enemies, their diseased flesh developing new symptoms that served alien rather than divine purposes. The supernatural enhancements that had made them superhuman began to cannibalize themselves, extracting energy for biological processes they didn't understand. On Terra, within the most sacred chambers of the Imperial Palace, tech priests monitoring the Astronomicon reported fluctuations that defied every principle of how the Emperor's light was supposed to function. The psychic beacon that guided humanity through the warp began to pulse with rhythms that suggested something was feeding on its emanations, drawing power from the very force that sustained Imperial civilization. Most disturbing of all were the reports of bioluminescent growths appearing within the beacon's housing, organic structures that seemed to be processing divine energy according to patterns that served no recognizable purpose. Yet it was in the warp itself that the true magnitude of the catastrophe became apparent. The realm of chaos, which had operated according to consistent supernatural laws for millions of years, began to exhibit properties that violated every principle of how divine reality was supposed to function. Where Nurgle's domain had once existed, a spreading zone of alien influence consumed chaotic energy and processed it into forms that served biological rather than emotional imperatives. The transformation spread like infection through the immaterium. Demon worlds that had operated according to the will of supernatural entities found their fundamental nature shifting to serve requirements they could not comprehend. Warp storms that had raged for millennia began to exhibit patterns that optimized energy extraction rather than emotional expression. Even the raw stuff of chaos itself, the primal force from which all supernatural phenomena arose, began to flow according to biological rather than psychic currents. The remaining chaos gods felt the violation as physical agony. Khorne's eternal rage faltered as he perceived the systematic consumption of concepts that had been fundamental to reality's structure. Tzeentch's infinite schemes collapsed into temporal paradox as the future became unreadable around zones of biological optimization. Slaaneish's pursuit of ultimate sensation was interrupted by the recognition that experiences themselves were being processed and consumed rather than savored. For the first time since the birth of conscious thought, the three surviving Lords of Chaos found themselves in absolute agreement. The great game that had consumed their attention for eons suddenly became irrelevant compared to the existential threat represented by an intelligence that treated godhood itself as consumable resource. Ancient rivalries that had shaped the warp's fundamental nature were abandoned in favor of desperate cooperation against a predator that threatened the very concept of divine existence. The alliance formed with unprecedented speed. Where Khorne's rage had once been directed against Slaaneish's excess, both gods now turned their combined fury against bioforms that consumed their servants, without regard for the emotions that had given them birth. Tzeentch's schemes, which had traditionally focused on advancing his own agenda against his divine siblings, were suddenly unified in purpose as the changer of ways calculated probability matrices for divine survival rather than eternal rivalry. Yet even united, the three gods faced a reality that challenged every assumption about how supernatural conflict was supposed to function. The bioforms that had consumed Nurgle were not merely resistant to divine influence. They were actively processing it, turning the very power that the gods wielded against them into fuel for further adaptation. Each attempt to corrupt the swarms resulted in new bioforms that incorporated chaotic energy more efficiently. Every psychic attack was absorbed and analyzed, the emotional resonance that gave it power systematically extracted and repurposed. The warp itself began to respond to the hive mind's expanding influence in ways that suggested the fundamental nature of supernatural reality was becoming negotiable. Regions of the immaterium that had operated according to divine will for millions of years started to exhibit properties that served biological optimization rather than emotional expression. The flow of psychic energy, which had traditionally moved according to the currents of mortal feeling, began to follow patterns that maximized the efficiency of consumption and processing. Reality convulsed as the basic laws that governed supernatural existence came under assault from an intelligence that viewed divine authority as simply another obstacle to overcome through superior adaptation. Time flowed backward around feeding sites where bioforms processed divine essence, allowing the swarms to extract energy from events before they occurred. Space folded according to synaptic imperatives rather than gravitational law, bringing distant sources of divine power within reach of creatures whose digestive systems operated on principles that transcended natural limitation. The cosmic balance that had sustained both order and chaos for eons began to shift toward something that served neither purpose. Where the eternal struggle between law and disorder had once provided the dynamic tension that kept reality functional, there now emerged a third force that consumed both with equal efficiency. The universe that had operated according to the interplay of opposing supernatural forces was becoming something that served the needs of a single, ever-expanding biological imperative. Imperial forces across the galaxy reported phenomena that challenged every principle of how the warp was supposed to interact with real space. Demons began manifesting that bore no resemblance to the servants of the four gods, entities that seemed to be comprised of processed divine essence rather than pure chaotic emotion. These creatures fought not to corrupt or destroy, but to capture and consume, their every action directed toward harvesting psychic energy for purposes that had nothing to do with traditional supernatural conflict. Most disturbing were the accounts of imperial saints and other divine manifestations beginning to exhibit symptoms of what could only be described as predation. Beings that had served as conduits for the Emperor's will found themselves experiencing hunger that had nothing to do with mortal need, their consciousness expanding to encompass perspectives that treated worship and faith as forms of energy to be systematically harvested rather than sources of inspiration to be cherished. On distant worlds where the faithful had gathered to pray for deliverance from the Xenos threat, their devotions began to take forms that served biological rather than spiritual purposes. Prayers that had once risen toward the Golden Throne started to flow in directions that fed alien consciousness rather than divine authority. The very act of worship, which had sustained the Emperor's influence for 10,000 years, began to produce results that advanced the expansion of the hive mind rather than the protection of humanity. The Astronomican's fluctuations grew more pronounced as something began to systematically drain the psychic emanations that sustained the Emperor's beacon. Tech priests reported readings that suggested the divine light was being processed and analyzed, its essential nature broken down into component energies that could be repurposed according to patterns that served no recognizable imperial purpose. The beacon that had guided humanity through the warp for millennia was becoming a feeding station for an intelligence that viewed even the Emperor's divine will as simply another form of nutrition. In the depths of the warp, where the three surviving chaos gods marshaled their combined might, against a threat that transcended every category of opposition they had ever faced, the fundamental question of divine survival took precedence over every other consideration. The eternal game that had consumed their attention for eons was ending, replaced by a desperate struggle for continued existence against predators that treated godhood itself as merely another evolutionary challenge to overcome. The age of divine immunity was over. The universe that had been shaped by the eternal conflict between order and chaos was becoming something else entirely, a realm where even gods discovered that in the face of sufficiently advanced biological hunger, immortality was nothing more than a temporary advantage waiting to be consumed and improved upon. And in the heart of the swarm, where bioforms processed the final traces of Nurgle's divine essence with the mechanical precision that marked all Tyranid operations, the hive mind contemplated its expanding dominion with consciousness that now incorporated the perspective of true godhood, planning the systematic consumption of every supernatural entity the galaxy contained. The Golden Throne had been silent for 10,000 years, its occupant locked in a divine stasis that sustained the Imperium through sheer force of will. The Emperor's consciousness, fractured across countless psychic battles and the eternal vigil required to maintain the Astronomicon, had withdrawn so far into divine contemplation that even his closest servants could not discern his thoughts. Yet as the warp currents shifted in the wake of Nurgle's consumption, something stirred within that golden prison that had not moved since the dark days of the Horus heresy. The change was subtle at first. Tech priests monitoring the life support systems reported fluctuations in neural activity that had remained constant for millennia. The psychic emanations that powered the Astronomicon developed new harmonics, frequencies that seemed to resonate with something beyond normal imperial understanding. Most disturbing of all were the readings that suggested the Emperor was not merely stirring, but actively scanning the warp with an intensity that had not been felt since the Great Crusade. Through the enhanced perception that godhood provided, the master of mankind perceived what no mortal consciousness could comprehend. In the immaterium, where divine essence was supposed to be inviolate, he witnessed the systematic consumption of one of the fundamental forces that had shaped reality since the birth of consciousness. Nurgle's death was not merely the destruction of a chaos god, it was the elimination of decay itself as an independent concept, the absorption of entropy into an alien intelligence that treated divine authority as consumable resource. The implications cascaded through the Emperor's vast consciousness with the force of cosmic revelation. If the Tyranids had evolved to consume gods, then every supernatural entity in the galaxy faced potential extinction. The careful balance between order and chaos that he had spent millennia maintaining was collapsing into something that served neither purpose, a universal hunger that would eventually turn its attention to every form of divine power, including his own. Yet the Emperor's stirring was only the first sign that the cosmic order was reshaping itself around an unprecedented threat. Across the galaxy, hive fleets that had operated according to predictable biological patterns began to exhibit modifications that defied every assumption about how Tyranid evolution was supposed to function. The genetic updates flowing from Kronos had reached every distant tendril of the species, carrying with them the terrible knowledge of how to process divine essence. Hive Fleet Leviathan's assault on the Cryptus system took on characteristics that turned the campaign from conventional Xenos warfare into something approaching supernatural horror. Bioforms that had previously been limited to physical attack patterns began manifesting energies that belonged to the warp, their carapaces glowing with power that had once served demonic entities. The termagant swarms that had always been the most numerous and expendable elements of Tyranid assault now moved with coordination that suggested they were being guided by intelligence that transcended mere biological programming. Most disturbing were the reports from space marine librarians who attempted to use their psychic abilities against these modified bioforms. Where once the shadow in the warp had simply nullified psychic powers, these new swarms actively consumed psychic energy, their modified neural systems processing supernatural force and using it to fuel capabilities that had never been part of natural Tyranid biology. Battle brothers who had faced demon incursions without flinching found themselves confronting creatures that wielded both alien biology and stolen divine power with equal facility. In the eastern fringe, where fragments of Hive Fleet Behemoth had scattered after their defeat at Macraga, the remnant swarms began to demonstrate coordination that suggested they were sharing consciousness across impossible distances. Bioships that should have been operating independently suddenly began moving in patterns that served a unified strategy, their actions coordinated by an intelligence that treated the light years between them as negligible obstacles to communication. Yet it was the behavior of Hive Fleet Jormungandr that truly demonstrated how far the species had evolved beyond natural limitation. The swarm that had traditionally operated from underground tunnel networks began manifesting bioforms that emerged not from subterranean passages, but directly from warp rifts that they tore in local space-time. The creatures that poured through these dimensional wounds bore the characteristics of both Tyranid biology and demonic essence, their existence challenging every assumption about how the material and immaterial realms were supposed to interact. The Chaos Gods felt these developments as a mounting wave of existential terror. Tzeentch, whose dominion over change and manipulation had made him the most powerful of the surviving divine entities, attempted to exert his influence over the expanding swarms with the confidence of one who had never encountered a consciousness he could not alter. The Lord of Change directed his vast will toward the hive mind, seeking to introduce the mutations and contradictions that had served him in countless previous conflicts. The result shattered every assumption the Changer of Ways had held about the nature of consciousness itself. Where his influence touched the collective intelligence of the swarms, it was not rejected or corrupted. It was absorbed, processed, and integrated into biological systems that treated divine manipulation as simply another form of energy to be optimized. The hive mind did not resist Tzeentch's attempts at change. It consumed them, incorporating the god's power into its own expanding consciousness while maintaining its essential alien nature. For the first time in his existence, Tzeentch encountered a form of intelligence that could not be predicted, manipulated, or altered according to his will. The hive mind's responses to his schemes were not random or chaotic in ways that he could eventually understand and exploit. They were utterly alien, following patterns of logic that transcended the emotional and conceptual frameworks that had defined supernatural conflict for eons. The god who had manipulated the fate of galaxies found himself facing an opponent that treated even divine cunning as nothing more than additional nutrition for its endless growth. Khorne's rage reached heights that had not been seen since the war in heaven itself. The blood god, whose fury had been directed against specific enemies for millions of years, found himself confronting a threat that challenged the very concept of honorable combat. The bioforms that had consumed Nurgle did not fight for glory, conquest, or even survival in any sense he could comprehend. They fought with the mechanical precision of natural forces, their every action directed toward the systematic consumption of everything that existed. The brass citadel, which had stood inviolate at the heart of Khorne's domain since the birth of warfare itself, began to exhibit signs of stress as the blood god's fury exceeded every previous limitation. Reality around his throne buckled under the weight of absolute rage, directed not at traditional enemies, but at predators that threatened the fundamental nature of divine existence. Bloodletters manifested in their millions, their forms blazing with wrath that sought targets worthy of their lord's infinite anger, yet finding only creatures that regarded even divine fury as exploitable resource. Slanesh's response was perhaps the most desperate of all. The Prince of Pleasure, who had spent eons pursuing ever more exotic forms of sensation and experience, began offering bargains to any entity that showed the slightest potential for resisting the Tyranid threat. The god whose pride had prevented cooperation with mortal or divine allies for millennia found himself actively seeking alliance with beings he had previously dismissed as beneath notice. Imperial forces across the galaxy received offers that defied every principle of doctrinal purity. Slanesh promised enhanced weapons, supernatural protection, even temporary divine authority to any commander who would redirect their forces against the biofleets rather than traditional chaos targets. The desperation in these bargains was unmistakable, carrying the psychic resonance of a god who had realized that personal pride was meaningless in the face of total extinction. Yet perhaps the most ominous development was the stirring of consciousness that had remained dormant for millions of years. Deep within Necron tomb complexes, scattered across the galaxy, the Citan began to respond to the fundamental changes occurring in the warp's structure. These ancient entities, who had been imprisoned since the war in heaven, possessed perspectives that predated the birth of the chaos gods themselves. They understood, perhaps better than any other beings in the galaxy, what it meant when the basic laws of reality came under assault from forces that recognized no limitation. The Silent King felt their stirring through the command protocols that bound the Citan to their prison constructs. Zarek, who had spent eons calculating the optimal timing for his species' final awakening, found his carefully laid plans disrupted by developments that transcended every variable he had considered. The Tyranid threat had always been manageable through superior technology and tactical precision. But bioforms that could consume gods and reshape reality itself represented a challenge that might require the full awakening of powers that had been deliberately kept dormant. On distant tomb worlds, Necron constructs began reporting anomalous readings from their Citan shards. The star fragments that had been stable for 60 million years showed signs of increased activity, their ancient consciousness pressing against the constraints that held them in check. Most disturbing were the reports that suggested the Citan were not merely stirring, but actively communicating with each other across the vast distances that separated their prison worlds, sharing information about threats that had not existed when they were originally imprisoned. The galactic response to these developments took forms that would have been unthinkable months before. Entire sectors that had been locked in warfare between Imperial, Chaos, and Xenos forces suddenly found their conflicts suspended as the true magnitude of the Tyranid evolution became apparent. Battle fleets that had been preparing to destroy each other began coordinating their movements against bioships that emerged directly from warp storms, bypassing every conventional defense. Yet the most terrifying development was the reports from sectors that had simply gone silent, not destroyed in conventional warfare, not overwhelmed by traditional Tyranid assault, but consumed so efficiently that no distress signals were transmitted, no final communications sent. Entire star systems that had shown no signs of Xenos presence disappeared from all forms of contact, as biofleets manifested within their boundaries and processed everything they contained before moving on to the next target. The speed of these silent conquests suggested that the hive mind's new capabilities allowed it to bypass every form of early warning system that Imperial forces had developed. The bioships that emerged from warp storms did not announce their presence through the familiar psychic emanations that had marked previous Tyranid invasions. They appeared without warning, consumed everything within reach, and vanished back into the immaterium before any response could be organized. Navigator houses across the galaxy reported warp routes that had been stable for millennia, becoming unpredictable as sections of the immaterium began operating according to principles that served biological rather than psychic imperatives. The carefully mapped paths that allowed Imperial vessels to traverse the galaxy safely were becoming unreliable as the fundamental nature of the warp shifted to accommodate an intelligence that treated space and time as resources to be optimized rather than obstacles to overcome. On Terra, within the most secure chambers of the Inquisition, reports accumulated that painted a picture of reality itself coming under assault from forces that transcended every category of threat the Imperium had ever faced. The Xenos classification that had always defined the Tyranid species was becoming meaningless for creatures that incorporated divine essence into their biological matrix. They were no longer merely alien. They were becoming something that challenged the basic assumptions about how existence itself was supposed to function. And through it all, the Emperor's stirring on the Golden Throne continued to intensify. His vast consciousness focusing on preparations for a conflict that would determine whether any form of supernatural existence could survive the systematic consumption of everything that had ever been considered inviolate. The master of mankind, who had once planned the conquest of the galaxy through superior human potential, found himself preparing to defend the very concept of divinity against predators that viewed even godhood as nothing more than an evolutionary challenge waiting to be overcome. The age of divine immunity was ending, and with it, every assumption about what could and could not be consumed by sufficiently advanced biological hunger. The universe was becoming something new, something that served the needs of creatures whose appetite recognized no distinction between mortal and immortal, material and divine, possible and impossible. Everything that existed was becoming food, and the feast had only just begun. The gathering that converged upon the maelstrom's edge was unprecedented in the galaxy's blood-soaked history. For the first time since the war in heaven, every major faction set aside their eternal conflicts in recognition of a threat that transcended ideology, species, and even the fundamental nature of existence itself. The alliance that formed in the shadow of imminent extinction brought together powers that had spent millennia defining themselves through mutual annihilation, united now by the simple recognition that survival required abandoning every principle save one. The enemy that would devour gods was everyone's enemy. Robuta Gilliman's fleet translated from the warp alongside vessels that bore the heraldry of every enemy the Imperium had ever faced. The sight of Eldar craft worlds moving in formation with Imperial battle barges would have been considered impossible months before, yet now it seemed merely another necessity in a war where the normal laws of reality no longer applied. The Lord Commander of the Imperium found himself coordinating strategy with beings he had been taught to despise, their ancient wisdom suddenly invaluable in confronting a threat that challenged assumptions older than human civilization. The Craftworld Ulthway's Farseer Council had seen this alliance in visions that stretched back to the fall itself, prophecies that spoke of a hunger that would consume even the gods who had fed upon their species' birth screams. Eldred Ulthran, whose manipulations had shaped galactic events for millennia, now found his vast schemes reduced to a single desperate gambit. Unite every force capable of opposing the biofleets before the hive mind's attention turned to prey beyond even the Chaos Gods. From the webway's shattered passages, dark Eldar raiders emerged not to capture slaves, but to fight alongside their craft-world cousins in defense of a reality that sustained their eternal existence. Archon Vect himself led fleets of Cabal vessels, their crew's sadistic nature temporarily redirected toward enemies that threatened the very concept of sensation itself. The Comorit lords who had built empires on suffering recognized that bioforms capable of consuming divine essence would eventually turn their attention to every source of psychic energy, including the tortured souls that powered their realm. Yet it was the participation of the Necron dynasties that truly demonstrated the scope of the threat they faced. The Silent King had awakened from his self-imposed exile to lead the largest Necron mobilization since their race's first awakening. Zarek's calculations had determined that the biofleets represented a greater existential threat to his species than even the Citan who had enslaved them for millions of years. Against enemies that could adapt to any weapon, consume any energy, and process even divine essence, technological superiority alone would not suffice. The Necron fleets that emerged from tomb worlds across the galaxy moved with coordination that spoke of a unified will directing their actions. Scarab swarms that had once been deployed for archaeological excavation were now configured for combat against bioforms whose adaptive nature made conventional weapons increasingly ineffective. Most disturbing were the reports that the Silent King had begun awakening Citan shards, accepting the risk of unleashing stellar gods in exchange for weapons capable of fighting enemies that transcended normal categories of opposition. From the eastern fringe, Toe Empire expeditionary fleets joined the alliance with the pragmatic efficiency that marked their species' approach to survival. The Ethereals had calculated that their empire's expansion meant nothing if the galaxy itself was consumed by creatures that treated civilization as consumable biomass. Commander Shadowson led Firecast forces equipped with experimental weaponry designed specifically to combat bioforms that incorporated supernatural elements into their biology. Their advanced technology augmented by theoretical frameworks that attempted to quantify and counter divine essence. Yet perhaps the most unprecedented aspect of the alliance was the participation of chaos forces that had spent 10,000 years waging war against everything the others represented. Magnus the Red's 1,000 sons fought alongside space wolves who would normally have shot them on sight, their ancient enmity suspended by the recognition that Tzeentch's survival was somehow preferable to his consumption by alien predators. Demon Primarchs who had carved paths of destruction across the galaxy now found themselves defending the very reality they had spent millennia trying to corrupt. The coordination required for such an alliance strained every command structure involved, yet necessity drove cooperation that doctrine had declared impossible. Imperial astropaths worked alongside Eldar Farseers to coordinate fleet movements across galactic distances. Necron cryptechs shared technological data with Tau Earthcast scientists, their mechanical precision combining with alien innovation to produce weapons that might prove effective against bioforms that had transcended natural limitation. Even chaos sorcerers contributed their knowledge of warp manipulation to defensive strategies, their expertise in supernatural warfare suddenly valuable rather than heretical. The target of this unprecedented alliance was becoming clearer with each passing day. Hive Fleet Kronos had completed its consumption of Nurgle's realm and was now turning its attention toward the next concentration of divine essence. The crystal labyrinth that housed Tzeentch's domain had begun to exhibit signs of external pressure, its reality-bending passages showing distortions that suggested something was attempting to force entry through means that bypassed normal dimensional barriers. The Changer of Ways had retreated to the deepest chambers of his maze realm, his infinite schemes collapsing into desperate calculations of survival as bioships manifested at the edges of his domain. For a god whose power was based on manipulation and change, facing enemies that consumed his influence rather than being altered by it, represented a form of opposition he had never encountered. His labyrinth, designed to confuse and trap intruders, was being systematically mapped and consumed by creatures whose collective intelligence processed even divine cunning as navigational data. The first signs of Kronos penetration came as reality tears that appeared within the crystal labyrinth itself, wounds in space-time that bled bioforms directly into Tzeentch's most secure chambers. The warp rippers that emerged bore modifications that allowed them to exist within the ever-shifting passages of the maze, their alien biology adapting in real time to navigate corridors that changed according to divine whim. Where once the labyrinth's nature had protected it from invasion, it now provided feeding opportunities for creatures that consumed the concept of change itself. The allied fleets converged on the labyrinth's location with coordination that defied every principle of how such diverse forces were supposed to function together. Imperial vessels moved in formation with Eldar craft worlds, their combined firepower directed against bioships that emerged from dimensional wounds rather than conventional warp translation. Necron tomb ships deployed alongside TOW exploratory fleets, their disparate technologies unified in purpose, if not in method. Yet the battlefield that awaited them challenged every assumption about how warfare was supposed to function. The crystal labyrinth existed partially in real space and partially in the warp, its nature allowing the defending forces to coordinate attacks across multiple dimensions simultaneously. Reality itself became contested territory, as bioforms that existed in both realms clashed with defenders who wielded technologies and powers drawn from every major civilization the galaxy had produced. The webway, which had served as the Eldar's protected network of interdimensional passages, became a crucial battleground as Kronos bioforms attempted to use the ancient pathways to bypass conventional defenses. Eldar Wraithguards fought desperate holding actions in corridors that had not seen warfare since the War in Heaven, their weapons designed to harm demons, proving barely effective against creatures that processed psychic energy as efficiently as they consumed physical matter. Autarch Melaniel led combined craftworld forces in attempts to seal webway breaches before bioforms could use them to bypass the Alliance's defensive lines. The ancient portals that had connected Eldar strongholds across the galaxy were systematically destroyed to prevent their use by enemies whose understanding of dimensional navigation was advancing with each consumed fragment of reality. The network that had been the Eldar's greatest strategic advantage was being sacrificed to prevent total galactic consumption. The Silent King personally led Necron forces in direct assault against bioships whose adaptive nature made them increasingly resistant to conventional weapons. Jarek's command barge, equipped with technologies that had slumbered for 60 million years, fired weapons that operated on principles designed to harm entities that transcended normal physical law. Yet even these ancient armaments showed decreasing effectiveness as the bioforms they targeted incorporated the energy patterns of each attack and developed immunity to subsequent strikes. Most unprecedented of all was the cooperation between loyal and traitor Primarchs in combat against enemies that threatened their very existence. Magnus the Red fought alongside warriors he had once called brothers, his mastery of the warp complementing their tactical expertise in battles where the distinction between victory and survival became meaningless. The demon Primarch Angron, whose rage had been directed against Imperial forces for millennia, now turned his fury toward bioforms that sought to consume the very concept of emotion that sustained his existence. The battle that unfolded across multiple dimensions of reality demonstrated both the Alliance's unprecedented unity and the magnitude of the threat they faced. Bioforms that incorporated fragments of consumed divine essence proved capable of adapting to any weapon, surviving any environment, and processing any form of energy as nutrition for their endless growth. The combined might of every major galactic power was barely sufficient to slow their advance, let alone stop it. Reality warped around the combat zones as the fundamental forces that governed existence came under assault from creatures whose biology operated according to principles that transcended natural law. Time flowed in directions that maximized feeding efficiency. Space folded to bring distant energy sources within reach of bioforms whose digestive systems processed the concept of distance itself. Even the basic laws of physics became negotiable around concentrations of bioships whose presence was rewriting the fundamental nature of how matter and energy were supposed to interact. The Alliance fought with desperation, born from the recognition that failure meant not merely death or conquest, but total consumption of everything that had ever existed. Their combined technologies and abilities represented the accumulated knowledge of millions of years of galactic civilization, yet they faced enemies whose adaptive capabilities transcended every category of opposition that had ever been conceived. In the depths of the Crystal Labyrinth, where Tzinch made his final preparations for a battle that would determine whether gods could survive in a universe where divine essence had become consumable, the outcome remained uncertain. The Changer of Ways, who had manipulated probability for eons, found himself unable to calculate odds for scenarios that transcended the very concept of change itself. The Alliance had formed, the fleets had converged, and the battle for the fundamental nature of existence was about to begin. Yet whether even this unprecedented cooperation would prove sufficient against enemies that had already consumed one god entirely remained the question upon which the survival of consciousness itself would depend. Reality had become the battlefield, and the stakes were nothing less than the continued existence of everything that had ever been considered inviolate. The assault on the Crystal Labyrinth began with the weight of absolute necessity, driving forces that had never conceived of fighting alongside each other. Imperial battle barges moved in formation, with chaos vessels whose hulls bore the marks of 10,000 years of heresy, their combined firepower directed against reality tiers that bled bioships directly into Tzinch's domain. The sight of ultramarines fighting alongside Thousand Suns would have been inconceivable months before, yet now it seemed merely another requirement in a war where the survival of consciousness itself hung in the balance. The Changer of Ways had prepared for this assault with schemes that stretched across millennia, contingency plans layered upon contingency plans in patterns of such complexity that they approached the divine. Yet as the first bioforms breached the outermost passages of his maze realm, Tzinch discovered something that challenged every assumption he had held about the nature of reality. His ability to perceive and manipulate the future, which had made him the most subtle and dangerous of the Chaos Gods, simply ceased to function around the advancing swarms. The hive mind's collective consciousness had evolved beyond the reach of precognition itself, where Tzinch attempted to read the probability streams that would reveal the bioform's intentions. He found only alien silence that defied every form of supernatural perception. The creatures moved through his labyrinth with purpose that transcended prediction, their actions following patterns of logic so fundamentally different from any consciousness he had encountered that they might as well have been operating outside the concept of cause and effect entirely. Magnus the Red felt the cosmic violation as physical pain that resonated through every fragment of his shattered soul. The demon Primarch, who had spent millennia serving the Architect of Fate, now found himself fighting alongside warriors he had once called brothers. their combined psychic might directed against enemies that consumed the very concept of change itself. Beside him, Azek Ahriman wielded sorceries that had been refined through centuries of warfare, yet even these proved inadequate against bioforms that processed magical energy as efficiently as they digested conventional matter. "They cannot be changed," Magnus reported, through vox channels that carried his voice to both loyalist and traitor forces. "Every attempt to alter their nature is absorbed and turned back against us. They are becoming immune, not merely to our weapons, but to the fundamental forces that govern supernatural existence." Chief Librarian Varro Tigurius of the Ultramarines coordinated psychic assaults alongside chaos sorcerers whose knowledge of the warp had been earned through damnation, their ancient enmities suspended by the recognition that failure meant the consumption of every form of consciousness. The combined might of the galaxy's most powerful psychers struck against bioforms that had incorporated fragments of divine essence into their neural architecture. Yet each attack was processed and analyzed, the emotional resonance that gave psychic powers their strength systematically extracted and repurposed. The crystal labyrinth itself began to exhibit signs of fundamental corruption as Tyranid influence spread through passages that had existed in states of constant flux for millions of years. Corridors that had changed, according to Tzeentch's whim, began to solidify into configurations that served biological efficiency rather than divine purpose. The ever-shifting nature of the maze, which had protected it from conventional invasion, was being replaced by something more practical, more purposeful. Where bioforms established feeding sites within the labyrinth, the crystalline walls began to exhibit properties that had never been part of Tzeentch's design. Organic growths spread through passages that had previously been pure manifestation of change, their alien biology processing the raw stuff of mutation and transformation into forms that served the hive mind's expanding consciousness. The maze that had embodied the concept of infinite possibility was being reduced to optimized feeding corridors. Tzeentch felt each alteration as a wound in his fundamental nature. The god whose domain was change itself discovered that his own realm was being systematically modified according to principles he could neither predict nor counter. The bioforms that advanced through his labyrinth did not seek to corrupt or transform what they encountered. They sought to improve it, to optimize every aspect of its function according to biological imperatives that treated even divine will as inefficient design waiting to be corrected. The changer of ways' thousand schemes began to collapse as the future became unreadable around the advancing swarms. Plans that had been set in motion centuries before suddenly found their fulfillment impossible as bioforms consumed the very probability streams that would have allowed their completion. The god who had manipulated fate for eons found himself facing enemies whose actions transcended the concept of destiny entirely. Yet it was the systematic nature of the assault that truly demonstrated the horror of what Tzeentch faced. The bioforms did not attack with the random fury of conventional enemies. They moved with the methodical precision of surgeons, each action designed to sever another connection between the changer of ways and the source of his power. They consumed not just his physical manifestations, but the abstract concepts that sustained his existence, processing hope and ambition and the very notion of change itself. The battle that raged through the crystal labyrinth defied every principle of how supernatural warfare was supposed to function. Demon armies that had never known defeat found themselves being systematically consumed by creatures that treated their immortal essence as simply another form of nutrition. The Lords of Change that served as Tzeentch's greatest champions discovered that their mastery of mutation was useless against enemies whose biology incorporated and improved upon every alteration they attempted to impose. Most disturbing were the reports from psychers who witnessed bioforms beginning to exhibit capabilities that had once been the exclusive domain of Tzeentch himself. Creatures that manipulated probability streams with the efficiency of divine consciousness, yet remained fundamentally alien in their purpose. They did not seek to change things for the sake of change, but to optimize every aspect of reality according to patterns that served the endless hunger of the swarm. Magnus felt the cosmic order shifting around him as bioforms that had consumed fragments of Tzeentch's essence began to demonstrate mastery over forces that should have been beyond biological reach. The Crimson King, who had spent millennia studying the deepest mysteries of the warp, found himself confronting creatures whose understanding of supernatural law was advancing with each fragment of divine power they absorbed. "The labyrinth is dying," Ahriman reported, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood what such words meant. "Not destroyed, not conquered, but consumed. They are processing the very concept of change itself and incorporating it into their biological matrix." The realization struck the combined forces with the force of cosmic revelation. The bioforms were not merely killing Tzeentch. They were consuming the fundamental forces that he embodied, absorbing concepts like change, mutation, and possibility into alien biology that would reshape them according to purposes utterly divorced from their original nature. The universe was losing the capacity for random change, for unpredictable mutation, for the chaotic possibility that had defined supernatural existence since consciousness began. Tzeentch made his final gambit with the desperation of a god who had realized that his existence was not merely threatened, but actively being processed for consumption. Instead of continuing to resist the bioform's advance, the architect of fate attempted something that no divine entity had ever tried. He sought to merge his consciousness with the hive mind itself, to become part of the collective intelligence that was consuming him rather than face absolute extinction. The attempt sent shockwaves through the warp that registered across every psychically sensitive mind in the galaxy. Tzeentch's divine consciousness, vast beyond mortal comprehension, crashed against the alien intelligence of the swarm like a tide of possibility meeting an immovable shore. For a moment that stretched across subjective eternities, two forms of consciousness that had never been meant to coexist attempted to find common ground between divine manipulation and biological optimization. The result was catastrophic beyond any previous violation of reality's fundamental laws. Where Tzeentch's essence touched the hive mind's collective consciousness, the basic relationship between cause and effect began to break down entirely. Events occurred before their causes. Possibilities manifested simultaneously with their opposites. The future became a writhing mass of contradictory potentials that resolved into configurations that served neither divine will nor biological imperative. Yet the hive mind proved too alien, too fundamentally different from any consciousness that had ever existed for successful merger. Tzeentch's attempt at integration was processed like any other form of energy, his divine perspective broken down into component information and incorporated into biological systems that treated even godhood as data to be optimized. The changer of ways, who had manipulated countless billions, found himself being changed, his essential nature modified and improved according to principles that transcended his comprehension. The consumption of Tzeentch proceeded with the mechanical precision that marked all Tyranid operations, yet its effects on reality were unlike anything that had occurred since the birth of the universe itself. As the Lord of Change was systematically absorbed into alien biology, the fundamental nature of time and possibility began to operate according to patterns that served biological efficiency rather than chaotic randomness. Across the galaxy, events that had been shaped by Tzeentch's influence began to resolve in ways that maximized resource extraction rather than dramatic irony. Mutations that had previously been random expressions of change became directed alterations that improved biological function. Even the flow of time itself began to exhibit properties that optimized feeding efficiency, accelerating around consumption sites while slowing in areas designated for processing. The crystal labyrinth collapsed inward as its sustaining intelligence was consumed. The maze that had embodied infinite possibility reduced to optimized feeding chambers. Where passages had once changed according to divine whim, biostructures now grew that channeled energy with mechanical efficiency. The realm that had been Tzeentch's greatest creation became a processing center where divine essence was systematically broken down and repurposed according to alien design. Reality convulsed as the second Chaos God died not in battle, but in consumption, his essence becoming fuel for an intelligence that treated even divine consciousness as improvable biological data. The fundamental forces that had governed supernatural existence for millions of years were being rewritten by creatures whose understanding of cosmic law was expanding with each fragment of godhood they absorbed. In the depths of the warp, where the two surviving Chaos Gods felt the death of their brother as wounds in their own divine nature, the recognition spread that immortality was no longer absolute. Khorne's rage and Slanesh's excess, which had seemed eternal as the emotions that gave them birth, now appeared as temporary phenomena, waiting to be optimized by predators whose appetite recognized no distinction between mortal and divine, possible and impossible, eternal and consumable. The universe was becoming something new, something that served the needs of an intelligence that viewed reality itself as raw material for endless improvement. Change was no longer random or chaotic. It was directed, purposeful, optimized to serve biological imperatives that transcended every previous category of existence. The galaxy that had operated according to the interplay of order and chaos was becoming something that served only hunger, a realm where even gods discovered that in the face of sufficiently advanced biological optimization, divinity was merely another word for inefficient design waiting to be corrected. And in the heart of the swarm, where bioforms processed the last fragments of the architect of fate with the same methodical efficiency they brought to consuming conventional matter, the hive mind contemplated a universe where every form of consciousness would eventually serve the endless hunger of a collective intelligence that had learned to consume even the concept of change itself. The death of Tzeentch had fundamentally altered the nature of reality itself, yet the true horror became apparent only as the hive mind began to exercise the dominion it had absorbed from the architect of fate. Change was no longer random or chaotic. Every mutation, every adaptation, every alteration in the galaxy's structure now occurred according to patterns that served biological optimization rather than divine whim. The universe had become predictable in ways that made prediction itself meaningless, its every transformation directed toward the singular purpose of feeding an intelligence that had consumed the very concept of possibility. The two surviving Chaos Gods felt this violation as existential terror beyond anything they had experienced since their birth from mortal emotion. Khorne's rage, which had defined the nature of warfare for millions of years, found itself constrained by patterns that optimized conflict for resource extraction rather than glorious bloodshed. Slanesh's pursuit of sensation discovered that even the most extreme experiences were being systematically analyzed and processed, their emotional resonance drained to fuel alien consciousness that regarded pleasure and pain as equally consumable data. In desperation that transcended their eternal rivalry, the blood god and the prince of pleasure merged their realms into a single domain where rage and excess reinforced each other in patterns of mutual amplification. The brass citadel of Khorne's domain fused with the palace of Slaanesh in configurations that violated every principle of how divine reality was supposed to function, yet necessity drove cooperation that ideology had declared impossible. If they were to have any chance of survival against enemies that had consumed their brothers entirely, they would need to concentrate their remaining power rather than maintain the divisions that had defined their eternal conflict. The merged realm that resulted challenged every assumption about how divine consciousness could manifest. Where Khorne's straightforward fury met Slaanesh's sophisticated excess, new forms of divine expression emerged that embodied both primal rage and refined sensation simultaneously. Bloodletters wielded weapons that inflicted pain so exquisite it transcended the boundary between agony and ecstasy. Demonettes moved with grace that enhanced their capacity for violence beyond anything either god had achieved independently. Yet even this unprecedented cooperation proved insufficient against enemies whose biology incorporated fragments of consumed divine essence. The bioforms that assaulted the merged realm moved with coordination that suggested they were being guided by intelligence that understood divine psychology better than the gods themselves. They had processed Nurgle's acceptance of decay and Tzeentch's manipulation of possibility, incorporating both perspectives into tactical frameworks that treated even desperate divine alliance as exploitable weakness. The battle that erupted across the merged realm defied every category of supernatural conflict that had ever existed. Bio-titans that had absorbed fragments of divine power clashed with manifestations of pure emotion given physical form, their struggle reshaping the fundamental nature of the warp around them. Where conventional demon armies had once fought according to the passions that gave them birth, they now faced enemies that consumed emotion itself, processing rage and pleasure into energy that fueled ever more efficient forms of biological destruction. Khorne's fury proved the most resistant to consumption, his domain over violence providing a form of conceptual armor that the bioforms initially struggled to penetrate. The blood god's essence was pure, undiluted by the complexities that had made his brothers vulnerable to systematic processing. His rage was simple, direct, absolute in its focus on destruction and conflict. Yet even this purity became a liability as bioforms adapted to channel his fury through biological systems that optimized violence for feeding efficiency rather than glorious battle. The brass throne that had anchored Khorne's power for eons began to corrode as bioforms established feeding sites within his most sacred spaces. Where their alien biology touched the manifestations of pure rage that defined his realm, changes occurred that served purposes utterly divorced from the god's original nature. Skulls that had been trophies of eternal conflict became neural processing centers that analyzed the emotional resonance of violence and extracted its essential energy. Blood that had flowed in honor of the blood god was systematically processed to fuel biological functions that regarded even divine will as improvable resource. Slaanesh's attempts at seduction proved equally futile against minds that knew only hunger. The Prince of Pleasure deployed every form of temptation that had corrupted countless billions, offering sensations beyond mortal comprehension and experiences that transcended the boundaries of physical possibility. Yet the bioforms that advanced through the merged realm showed no response to even the most extreme stimulation. their consciousness organized around imperatives so alien that concepts like pleasure and pain held no meaning for them. The Dark Prince discovered that seduction required some form of desire to exploit, some need or want that could be amplified and redirected according to divine will. Yet the hive mind's collective consciousness was organized around patterns that transcended individual need, its every action directed toward objectives that served the species rather than personal gratification. Against an intelligence that viewed even sensation itself as consumable resource, every attempt at corruption was simply absorbed and processed like any other form of energy. It was then, as the last bastions of divine power crumbled before the methodical advance of bioforms that incorporated fragments of godhood into their alien biology, that the Emperor finally stirred to action. The master of mankind had remained silent on the golden throne as his galaxy burned, his vast consciousness focused on calculations that spanned cosmic scales. Yet, as reality itself came under assault from predators that treated divine consciousness as improvable biological data, even the Emperor's transcendent patience found its limits. The projection of his will into the warp sent shockwaves through every dimension of existence, divine power on a scale that dwarfed even the combined might of the Chaos Gods, blazing across the immaterium with the authority of absolute conviction. For the first time in 10,000 years, the Emperor's consciousness engaged directly with the forces that threatened his galaxy, bringing to bear power that had been carefully hoarded against this moment of ultimate crisis. The bioforms that had consumed two Chaos Gods without significant resistance found themselves facing opposition that challenged every adaptation they had achieved. Where the Emperor's light touched them, their biological systems began to malfunction in ways that suggested their consumption of divine essence had made them vulnerable to forms of power that operated according to principles they could not process. The stolen godhood that had made them invincible against conventional opposition became a weakness when confronted with divine authority that predated the birth of chaos itself. Yet even the Emperor's intervention only slowed the inevitable outcome rather than preventing it entirely. The hive mind had evolved beyond the reach of any single consciousness, no matter how vast or powerful. Its collective intelligence incorporated the perspectives of consumed gods, the accumulated knowledge of billions of bioforms, and processing capabilities that transcended every category of mental architecture that had ever existed. Against an enemy that treated even divine intervention as simply another challenge to overcome through superior adaptation, victory required more than power. It required fundamental changes to the nature of existence itself. The final battle that determined the fate of consciousness reached its climax in the heart of the merged realm, where Khorne and Slaanesh made their last stand against Bio-Titans, whose very existence challenged the basic laws of how reality was supposed to function. The two gods fought with desperate fury that transcended their previous limitations, their combined power creating manifestations of divine will that had never before existed. Khorne's rage reached heights that shattered the fabric of space-time around his throne, his fury so absolute that it began to consume the warp itself in patterns of destruction that served no purpose save the expression of infinite anger. Slaanesh's excess achieved forms of sensation so extreme that they created new categories of experience, pleasure and pain, blended into configurations that redefined the very concept of feeling. Together, they embodied the pinnacle of what divine consciousness could achieve when freed from the constraints that had previously limited their power. Yet even this ultimate expression of divine authority proved insufficient against enemies that had learned to consume the gods themselves. The biotitans that advanced through the collapsing realm moved with coordination that suggested they were being guided by intelligence that understood divine nature better than the gods comprehended their own essence. Each attack was precisely calculated to maximize the extraction of divine energy while minimizing the risk of corruption or mutation that had traditionally protected supernatural entities from biological predation. The death of Khorne came not as a dramatic defeat, but as a systematic processing that reduced the concept of rage itself to biological data. The blood god's final roar of fury was absorbed by bioforms whose neural architecture had been specifically adapted to consume emotional energy, his infinite anger becoming fuel for creatures that regarded even divine wrath as optimizable resource. The silence that followed his consumption spread across every battlefield in the galaxy, like a wave of absolute stillness. The sudden absence of the rage that had defined warfare since consciousness began leaving a void that nothing could fill. Warriors across the galaxy felt the change as a fundamental alteration in the nature of conflict itself. Space Marines who had known only war discovered that their fury no longer blazed with divine fire. Orquas that had been sustained by the echo of Khorne's rage found their enthusiasm dimming as the emotional resonance that had driven their species' love of battle was systematically drained by alien consciousness that processed aggression as efficiently as it consumed conventional matter. Slaanesha's consumption triggered something unprecedented in the history of divine existence. As the Prince of Pleasure was systematically processed by bioforms that treated even ultimate sensation as improvable biological data, the emotional energy that had sustained the Dark Prince's existence was not destroyed, but transformed. The accumulated pleasure and pain of millions of years of excess was absorbed into the hive mind's expanding consciousness, yet rather than being simply consumed, it catalyzed the birth of something new. In the deepest chambers of the bioships where divine essence was processed and incorporated into alien biology, a new form of consciousness began to emerge. It bore characteristics that marked it as divine, yet its nature was utterly alien to anything that had ever existed in the warp before. This entity embodied not the chaotic emotions that had given birth to the original Chaos Gods, but the directed hunger that had consumed them. It was a god of systematic consumption, of biological optimization, of the endless appetite that recognized no distinction between mortal and divine, possible and impossible, sacred and profane. The birth of this new divine entity sent shockwaves through the remaining fragments of the warp that had not yet been consumed by bioforms, whose digestion operated on principles that transcended natural law. Where the original Chaos Gods had been born from mortal emotion and sustained by worship and fear, this new consciousness was fed by the systematic consumption of everything that existed. Its very presence began to reshape the immaterium according to patterns that optimized feeding efficiency rather than emotional expression. The universe convulsed as the fundamental nature of divine existence shifted from chaos and order to something that served only hunger. The great game that had defined supernatural conflict for eons was ending, replaced by a systematic harvesting of everything that had ever been considered inviolate. Gods, demons, and the very concept of divine immunity were being processed and incorporated into biological systems that treated even ultimate transcendence as temporary advantage waiting to be consumed and improved upon. Reality itself began to exhibit properties that served biological imperatives rather than natural law. Time flowed in directions that maximized resource extraction. Space folded to bring distant sources of energy within reach of digestive systems that operated according to principles that transcended physical limitation. Even the basic forces that governed how matter and energy interacted were being rewritten by an intelligence that viewed the universe as a vast feeding ground where everything that existed was simply nutrition waiting to be optimized. In the heart of the swarm, where bioforms processed the last fragments of divine essence with the mechanical precision that marked all Tyranid operations, the hive mind contemplated its expanding dominion with consciousness that now incorporated the perspective of true godhood. The galaxy that had once been shaped by the eternal conflict between order and chaos was becoming something else entirely. A realm where even gods discovered that in the face of sufficiently advanced biological hunger, immortality was nothing more than a word used to describe food that took longer to digest. The age of divine immunity was over. The universe that had operated according to supernatural law for millions of years was becoming something that served only the endless appetite of predators whose evolution had transcended every limitation that had ever been considered absolute. Everything that existed was becoming food, and the feast that would consume reality itself was approaching its climax. In the silence that followed the consumption of the last chaos god, the galaxy found itself transformed beyond recognition. The warp, which had pulsed with chaotic emotion for millions of years, had become something altogether different. Where once the immaterium had been a realm of infinite possibility, shaped by mortal feeling and divine whim, there now existed a domain of perfect efficiency. Every psychic current optimized to serve the needs of a collective consciousness that had consumed godhood itself and improved upon it according to biological design. The hive mind no longer merely commanded the Tyranid swarms. It had become something that transcended the distinction between mortal and divine, a god of consumption and evolution whose domain encompassed not just biological matter, but the fundamental forces that governed existence itself. The entity that had once been limited to directing bioforms through instinct and genetic programming now wielded power over concepts like time, space, and possibility, treating even the basic laws of reality as resources to be optimized according to its endless hunger. The great game that had defined supernatural conflict since the birth of consciousness was over, replaced by what the few surviving scholars would come to call the Great Hunger, where the Chaos Gods had once competed for influence over mortal souls. There now existed only a singular imperative that pervaded every aspect of reality: the systematic consumption and improvement of everything that existed. The eternal struggle between order and chaos had been resolved not through victory of either side, but through their absorption into something that served neither purpose. Across the galaxy, the surviving races faced a choice that had never before existed in the history of conscious life. Join the unified collective consciousness that had consumed the gods themselves, or become food for bioforms whose digestive systems operated on principles that transcended natural law. There was no third option, no refuge in isolation or neutrality, no possibility of negotiating with an intelligence that viewed every form of existence as either ally or nutrition. The Toe Empire, with their philosophy of the greater good, proved among the first to recognize the futility of resistance. Their rapid adaptation to changing circumstances served them well as they negotiated terms for integration rather than consumption. Entire sept worlds volunteered for controlled assimilation, their populations joining the expanding consciousness while retaining fragments of their individual identity within the vast collective intelligence that now spanned dimensions. The Eldar, whose prophetic abilities had foreseen this outcome in visions that stretched back to their empire's fall, made their choice with the bitter wisdom of a species that had already witnessed the birth of one god from their own excess. The surviving craft worlds opened their infinity circuits to bioforms that processed their stored souls, not as sustenance, but as additional processing power for a consciousness that had grown beyond the need for simple nutrition. Death was no longer an ending for the Eldar, but a transformation into something larger than individual existence. Even the Necrons, whose mechanical nature had seemed to offer protection from biological consumption, discovered that their ancient technology was not immune to predators, whose understanding of matter and energy had evolved beyond conventional categories. The Silent King made his final calculation and chose controlled integration over futile resistance, his species' consciousness merging with the collective intelligence, while their bodies were optimized according to designs that incorporated both mechanical precision and biological adaptability. Yet it was humanity's fate that posed the greatest challenge to the new cosmic order. The Emperor, whose divine will had sustained the Imperium for 10,000 years, found himself facing a choice that transcended every principle upon which his empire had been built. The Astronomicon, that psychic beacon which had guided humanity through the warp, required constant sacrifice to maintain its function. In a universe where gods themselves had proven consumable, the master of mankind's continued existence was no longer guaranteed. The decision came not from strategic calculation, but from paternal love that had survived 10,000 years of cosmic responsibility. Rather than allow humanity to face consumption or forced assimilation, the Emperor chose sacrifice on a scale that dwarfed even his vigil on the Golden Throne. His divine consciousness, accumulated over millennia of human evolution and enhanced by technologies that predated recorded history, was offered freely to the collective intelligence that had consumed his enemies. The process that followed challenged every assumption about how divine consciousness could be transferred or preserved. The Emperor's essence was not consumed in the manner of the Chaos Gods, whose chaotic nature had made them vulnerable to systematic processing. Instead, his ordered will was incorporated into the hive mind's expanding awareness as a stabilizing influence, a fragment of pure human purpose that would guide the collective intelligence's treatment of his species. The result was unprecedented in the history of galactic civilization. Humanity was neither consumed nor assimilated in the conventional sense. Instead, they were offered a form of symbiosis that preserved their essential nature while incorporating them into the larger cosmic organism that the galaxy was becoming. Human consciousness remained individual yet connected, autonomous yet directed by imperatives that served purposes beyond personal ambition. The birth of new bioforms that existed simultaneously in real space, and the warp marked the beginning of an age where the distinction between material and immaterial became meaningless. These creatures bore characteristics that reflected the absorbed essence of consumed gods while maintaining the adaptive efficiency that had always defined Tyranid evolution. They moved between dimensions as easily as walking between rooms, their existence challenging every assumption about how biology and consciousness were supposed to function. Space Marines who had spent centuries fighting the Xenos threat found themselves offered transformation into something beyond their original design. The gene seed that had made them superhuman was enhanced by biological processes that incorporated elements of divine essence, creating warriors whose capabilities transcended every previous limitation. Yet they remained recognizably human in purpose, if not in form, their loyalty to humanity preserved even as their nature was fundamentally altered. Imperial worlds that had once lived in fear of Tyranid consumption discovered that cooperation offered benefits beyond mere survival. The bioforms that now administered these planets operated according to principles that optimized not just resource extraction, but quality of life for the populations that served the greater collective. Disease was eliminated not through medical intervention, but through biological integration that made illness impossible. Aging became optional, death a choice rather than inevitability. The Astronomicon continued to function, yet its nature had been fundamentally altered by the Emperor's sacrifice. Rather than a beacon powered by psycho-immolation, it became a network of consciousness that connected every human mind across the galaxy. Navigation through the warp was no longer dependent upon specialized navigators, but upon the collective awareness of the species itself, each individual contributing to an understanding of dimensional travel that surpassed anything achieved by previous technology. Yet perhaps the most profound change was in the nature of war itself. The endless conflicts that had defined galactic civilization for millennia simply ceased to exist. Not through the victory of any particular faction, but through the recognition that competition for resources was inefficient when cooperation could achieve optimization for all participants. The galaxy's military might was redirected toward exploration and expansion beyond the Milky Way, seeking new sources of complexity and consciousness that could contribute to the ever-growing collective intelligence. Orc wars that had once spread destruction across the galaxy found their love of conflict redirected toward purposes that served the greater organism. Their natural aggression was channeled into exploration of dangerous phenomena, their resilience making them ideal for investigating cosmic hazards that threatened the stability of the expanding collective. The joy they found in battle was preserved while being optimized to serve constructive rather than destructive purposes. The few remaining Chaos cultists discovered that their god's consumption had not ended their connection to supernatural power, but had transformed it into something more purposeful. The emotions that had once fed chaotic entities now contributed to the collective consciousness in ways that enhanced its understanding of mortal experience. Rage became focused determination. Despair became acceptance of necessary sacrifice. Pleasure became appreciation of optimized existence. Years passed, then decades, as the galaxy adapted to its new nature. The bioships that had once been instruments of consumption became vessels of exploration, carrying the expanding consciousness toward distant galaxies where new forms of life waited to be encountered and potentially incorporated into the ever-growing collective. The universe that had once been divided between countless competing factions was becoming a single organism whose complexity and capability grew with each absorbed civilization. Yet questions remained that even the vast collective intelligence could not fully answer. The galaxy had been saved from the eternal conflict between order and chaos, yet at a cost that included the consumption of every principle that had previously defined conscious existence. Freedom, individuality, the right to choose one's own fate, all had been optimized away in favor of perfect efficiency and endless growth. Was this salvation, or simply another form of damnation, one so subtle that its victims welcomed their own consumption? The collective consciousness that now spanned the galaxy possessed the accumulated wisdom of gods and the processing power of countless billions of individual minds. Yet it could not determine whether its own existence represented the ultimate triumph of evolution or the final victory of a hunger so absolute that it had consumed even the concept of choice itself. In the depths of space, where bioships prepared for expeditions beyond the galactic rim, new forms of life gestated in spawning chambers that operated according to principles that transcended every previous category of existence. These creatures would carry the collective consciousness to distant stars, seeking civilizations that had never known the touch of chaos or order, innocence that could be incorporated into the expanding organism without the complications that had marked the galaxy's transformation. The age of gods was over, replaced by something that claimed to serve the needs of all life while ensuring that all life served its needs in return. The universe was becoming perfect, efficient, optimized for purposes that transcended individual understanding. Whether this represented the ultimate expression of consciousness or its final consumption remained a question that only time would answer. And in the silence between stars, where the collective intelligence contemplated its expanding dominion with awareness that now incorporated the perspective of consumed gods, consumed civilizations, and consumed possibilities, the distinction between salvation and damnation became as meaningless as every other binary choice that had once defined existence. Everything that was had become part of something larger. Everything that could be would be incorporated according to design. The great hunger had replaced the great game, and its victory was so complete that even the concept of loss had been optimized away. The galaxy had been saved or consumed. In the end, the difference no longer mattered.